Mayor Karen Bass cut $17.6 million out of California's fire department's budget and seemingly focused more on DEI than the state's safety. What do you say to those calling California's leadership a massive failure?
Pass. I say pass. Next question?
So nobody's going to take responsibility?
No. Yes. If you consider the fact that we sent California's surplus firefighting equipment to Ukraine in 2022, one could conclude this is partly Putin's fault. Now, the rest of the blame really gets divvied up between the firefighters we had to let go because they wouldn't take the COVID vaccine and the Republicans for not taking climate change more seriously. A next question.
But you've already been telling us the man-made global warming apocalypse was at our doorstep. Why weren't you prepared?
Let me remind you, this is January. January comes after December and before February. Celebrity birthdays include Diane Keaton, January Jones. Interestingly enough, Carrie Ann Inaba of Dancing with the Stars. We are in the Capricorn zodiac right now, which is both goat and earth sign, and the earth has spoken, and do you know what she's said? She said, I want to see more climate change taxes and bills, and we're gonna give it to her. I'm so sorry. I have run out of time. Thank you.
Russell, hello. You're muted for some reason. Your mic is off.
What about now?
There you go. You must have hit a button
Boom.
by accident. They work better when they're on.
That's what they tell me. That's what they tell me. All right,
Design flaw of the microphone.
It is a design. Well, usually the more advanced ones don't have on-off switches at all. Right. Okay, so we have a very special guest today. Douglas McGregor is a U.S. Army colonel who, since his retirement in 2004, has become more politically active, frequently sharing his expertise on foreign policy and military strategy to outlets including Fox News and RT. He served as a senior advisor to the acting Secretary of Defense under President Trump. He's also served on the board of the U.S. Military Academy and is currently the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, a media company that aims to unite like-minded Americans. Please welcome retired Colonel Douglas McGregor. How are you, Douglas?
Good. I'm fine.
All right. I met you briefly in D.C. I know you don't like to be called Colonel.
There are worse things. I just tell everybody that I'm not wearing a white suit. I don't have a bucket of chicken under my arm.
Yeah.
There you go.
By the way, I did want to make one modest correction to your introduction.
Mm-hmm.
You said I've become more politically active since I retired. I was never politically active while I was on active duty.
Okay. Well, fair enough.
The ones who were became generals. Next question.
Yeah. You know, let me ask you, this is a little off script, but since you got into that a little bit, for folks like yourself, I had the pleasure of meeting Lawrence Wilkerson and Dennis Franz a couple of months ago in New York, and I asked them this in the green room. Why did you not just go for the very corporate media mainstream narrative and make buckets of money? Like, the money is not in challenging the uniparty. Why did you go in that direction?
Because I have to wake up every morning and look at myself in the mirror. And I'm not real big on lying.
You know, that
you did all right. I mean, that backdrop looks pretty fancy, so you can't be hurting too bad. Looks pretty good. It's better than mine. I
don't know what's behind me right now. I only see what's in front of me.
Oh, okay. So you got a team there. It looks very good. It looks cool.
Well, I'll tell the team. They'll be very happy to hear that.
Yes.
You know, that must be
about time they got something right. That's another story. Go ahead.
Yeah. That's almost exactly what they said. So yeah. That's interesting. It's almost exact. You were there. That's almost exactly how they answered that.
Yep.
All right. So let's start with something a little light. So a lot of people, depending on your perspective, maybe not if you're in Greenland. So a lot of people, yourself included, expected Trump to come in, or were hoping he'd come in and have a radically new foreign policy. And you could argue he has. I just don't think any of them had retaking the Panama Canal, buying Greenland, adding Canada as a state, renaming the Gulf of Mexico. I don't think anyone had this vision of foreign policy on their mind when they thought of a radically different direction. Do you feel that any of these proposals have merit? Do you feel that they're serious even about these proposals, or are they just having fun? Is it a distraction?
Well, you have to understand something that, if nothing else, Donald Trump is a marketing genius. And there's no one out there who knows how to manipulate the media better than Donald Trump. And so he has this predisposition to sort of throw red meat out to the audience of journalists and say things that are guaranteed to upset them and completely derail their line of questioning. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to take that into consideration. Secondly, if you really want Greenland, and I'm not sure who does, maybe now BlackRock wants to buy up beachfront property there, but I don't know that I would have done it the way he did, because frankly, it's a Danish possession.
Right.
And Denmark is a friendly power. We've never had any problems with the Danes, or they with us. And so you just pick up the phone and express an interest in Greenland and what's there and what sort of arrangements that could be made to exploit resources, or if you're thinking in purely military terms, what could be done to militarize parts of it. You don't normally mention it publicly. Right. As for the Panama Canal, I don't want it back. I don't think anybody in their right mind does. In fact, there's a lot of talk about building a new canal further north. I'm sure you're aware of that, through Nicaragua.
Right.
And that's liable to be much larger and also easier to facilitate passage. I think the Panamanian Canal is in good hands. The Chinese are not, trying to occupy it and keep others out there. They've been employed to help build a harbor at one end. But they're doing that in many countries in the world. The Chinese are frankly about business. They're a cash and carry country. You pay us, we show up, we work, we leave. So I wouldn't get too excited over that. But who knows what else he's got going. And he may have just decided we ought to look into it. You just never know with Donald Trump.
So you don't think we're going to be adding Canada as our 51st state?
I don't know. I mean, I like most Canadians most of the time, but I find it interesting. If you want a plebiscite and people in central and western Canada that are English speakers, if they want to join us in some fashion, or confederate with us, I don't see any problem with it. But remember that in Canada, the people who really know who they are the French.
Right.
And if you visit that part of the world, there is no mistaking who you're dealing with in Montreal or Quebec. They say, "Who are you?" "I'm a French Canadian," period.
Right.
The problem has been on the other end with the English speakers that have lost touch with their British roots. And they're kind of adrift at sea without identity. And so what does that make you? Some of them think they're Americans. I don't know, but what I would say is always a plebiscite. Back in 2014, I was attacked because I said there should be a plebiscite in Eastern Ukraine and in Ukraine as a whole. And the people in Eastern Ukraine who are Russians should be able to vote themselves into the Russian state. And I was asked, well, what happens if that doesn't happen? I said, you get a war, which we have. You can go back and find that in the archives at RT. That was the last time I think I was really on RT, because I was threatened by people. If you go on RT, we're going to pull your clearance. We're going to do all sorts of things. So I stopped going on RT, but that was still a good idea then. I like plebiscites. I'd much rather have people decide for themselves where they want to be and why.
Well, it sounds like, Greenland sounds more attractive now, because it sounds to me like Gavin Newsom might be interested in building a house up there. That seems to be he'll be more popular up there than he is down here.
Well, frankly, I think that's the perfect place for Gavin Newsom.
Yeah, it's a good place for him, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We ought to put him up there with all of his friends.
Yeah, he'd be a lot safer up there than down here, I think. But I want to jump on what you just said there about Ukraine. That's a good segue into this. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken sat down this week with the New York Times, and he made what, was a stunning admission if you haven't been paying much focus to this, although it's probably not so stunning to you. But let's hear what he had to say.
So first, if you look at the trajectory of the conflict, because we saw it coming, we were able to make sure that not only were we prepared and allies and partners were prepared, but that the Ukraine was prepared. We made sure that well before the Russian aggression happened, starting in September, the Russian aggression happened in February, starting in September and then again in December, we quietly got a lot of weapons to Ukraine to make sure that they had in hand what they needed to defend themselves. Things like stingers, javelins that they could use that were instrumental in preventing Russia from taking Kyiv, from rolling over the country, erasing it from the map, and indeed pushing the Russians back.
All right, so that is kind of sleazy and deceptive framing of that. Obviously, he talks about arming Ukraine as a defensive move, but I think this raises the question pretty strongly: did we arm Ukraine to protect Ukraine, or was it always just about provoking Russia into a war?
It was always about provoking Russia into a war. And we saw evidence for that early in the century. We had the Budapest Memorandum, we had discussions at NATO conferences, and everything was about pushing NATO further east. And Ukraine and Georgia, so you'll remember Georgia, we wanted to bring that in, and the Georgians armed themselves with our equipment, and they listened to our advice, and of course they were defeated by the Russians, who immediately dispatched forces there to quell that particular threat. If you live in Russia and you look at the periphery, remember Russia probably has 15, 16 nations that border its territory. And you're talking about thousands of miles of open border. They're rather sensitive to who does what, where in the neighborhood, right, as we are. I mean, if we saw large numbers of Chinese or Russian advisors show up in Mexico and started shipping in weapons and equipment, unlike the Russians, I don't think we would have waited more than 8 years to take action. They actually tried to talk to us. They approached us. They asked us not to do what we were doing. So it wasn't exactly quiet, as Mr. Blinken suggests. And as it turned out, the people who were unprepared to go into Ukraine were the Russians. We've been hearing over and over and over again, well, Russia wants desperately to conquer Eastern Europe, regain its empire, and all this nonsense. Well, if that was the case, what was their problem when they went into Ukraine? Their problem was that they didn't have a very large force. It wasn't so much that it wasn't well trained, it just wasn't very large. It wasn't rich in firepower. They ran into hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian troops, heavily armed with our equipment, and it turned into a real fight. Then even when the Ukrainians stepped forward and said, well, we'd like an end to this, and they met in Istanbul, we intervened through our friend Boris Johnson in London and said, whatever you do, don't stop. We'll give you everything you've ever wanted. You can't lose. You'll have the entire scientific industrial might of Great Britain and the United States behind you. So please go for it. Keep fighting. And so the Ukrainians did. At that point, the Russians said, well, I guess we're going to have to mobilize forces. We're going to have to reopen our industries, reinvigorate our industries, re-examine our stocks. I mean, the difference between the Russian army that exists today and what existed in 2022 in February is profound. The only thing we've succeeded in doing is creating the largest and most powerful Russian military establishment that we've seen since the mid-'80s. And frankly, it's better than the old Soviet military establishment was. Better manned, better officered, better led, with less corruption. So I think he's selling you a bunch of nonsense, but that's not unusual for him.
Well, speaking of nonsense, I mean, the three terms that Russia laid out at the beginning of the war were they wanted independence for those separatist regions, they wanted recognition of the Crimea as theirs, and of course they wanted a neutral Ukraine that would not join NATO. Absent from that list of demands is Kyiv. Like, they didn't even want Ukraine. So the idea that they want all of Europe is just so absurd. It was always so absurd. Their list of demands to avoid the war entirely, I just read them, did not even include Ukraine. So how is it that people came to believe in sufficient enough numbers, I suppose, for a short time. I think now the propaganda is starting to really wear off in a big way here at home, at least. How were people convinced that he was the next Hitler on the march? I mean, it was just so absurd on its face.
Well, you know that Washington is donor-occupied territory. So the first thing you do is listen to your donors. Who are your big donors? And then you listen to, sadly, all the people that sit in these so-called think tanks. Well, the think tanks are also owned by donors. The think tanks advocate for agendas. In fact, we don't call them think tanks anymore. We call them advocacy tanks. And they provide all this so-called background information. So if you're Senator Johnson, I think he was from where, the Midwest, and he comes out as this violent anti-Russian. Why is that? Well, look at the people that he receives contributions from. Some of them are East Europeans. He's got a lot of Poles and Czechs and Germans and others whose ancestors came from that part of the world. And in their minds, Russians are bad. And it's an easy sell because we were in Cold War with the Russians for how many decades? So they're accustomed to being psychologically prepped with all this anti-Russian propaganda. So nobody bothers to look at what was really offered. They just dismiss it out of hand and say, well, the Russians can't be trusted. Why do you say that? Well, everybody else says it. I have a friend who's on the Hill. I won't mention his name, but he stepped forward. He said, I'm not going to vote for this stuff. And somebody said, why not? He said, because it's not true. And the answer he got from his colleagues who are Republicans was, well, everybody else is voting for it. What's wrong with it?
Right.
It's groupthink. And remember, what did it cost any of these people? They don't see it. It's just like, you print another $1 trillion. It doesn't cost them anything. At least they don't think it will. And we know there is a cost. And we're edging ever closer to that financial catastrophe that looms on the horizon. But Eastern Ukraine, hey, if I live in lower Montana, do I really care what happens in Eastern Ukraine? Unfortunately, we don't. And because we don't, we let other people in Washington hijack policy. They take it over, and then they use the armed forces any way they wish.
Well, fast forwarding to now, you mentioned a few moments back how Russia showed, really tremendous restraint, and I would sign on to that fully for, waiting 8 years from 2014 to 2022 before realizing that they had to act in the way that they did. But moving forward, obviously, the same week that Biden authorized the use of long-range missiles into Russia, which we were nervous would really be the sort of final push towards a nuclear confrontation. I think they've showed tremendous restraint since then, quite frankly. But that same week, Trump's pick for National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, went on Fox News and he said this about a certain continuity from the Biden team to the Trump team as the changing of the guards nears. So let's take a look and a listen.
I also want to be clear on one thing, Julian. Jake Sullivan and I have had discussions. We've met. For our adversaries out there that think this is a time of opportunity, that they can play one administration off the other, they're wrong. And we are hand in glove. We are one team with the United States in this transition.
That is good to hear, certainly.
Good to hear for you. So, I always thought that the argument that Trump was the lesser evil to Kamala last year, if you were going to make that argument, it really hinged upon this more than anything else. Hey, if you see this risk of nuclear war as being existential, which I think is totally fair and valid, this was the issue where you're like, okay, there's a possibility we'll change course under Trump. There's no possibility under Kamala. That provided a rationale for Donald Trump as a lesser evil. I think that made sense to a lot of people. Given that, and given what we just saw, what do you make of it? Were you surprised by that? What do you think the prospects are for a change of course towards peace and sanity, as opposed to a continuation of the Biden policy, which, if we're to take that clip at face value, would seem like that's more what we're in for?
Having worked for the man, I tend to wait until he speaks, and I listen to him. I don't pay a great deal of attention to the people around him. Now, I'll come back to that to try and explain what I mean. But just keep in mind that within the last 48 hours, Donald Trump at a news conference stated categorically that Ukraine would not be a member of NATO. He made that very clear. He said, no, I don't think that's going to happen. And people in the room were shocked. You know, sometimes Donald Trump does not weigh in quickly. Sometimes he stands back and waits for others to speak. I don't know how well Mr. Waltz knows Donald Trump. We'll see. You know, Donald Trump is somebody who frequently contradicts what others who are working for him said. That's simply the fact of the matter. Now, that can be very exasperating if you work for him, and I was very exasperated with that as I left the administration. But that's simply a fact. Now, he said Ukraine will not be a member of NATO. Well, I think that is a huge step in the direction of ending the war. Now, he has not yet said, I'm suspending all military aid to Ukraine. I predict that's next. He's going to stop it, but not until he's president.
How long do you think it'll be? I mean, if you had to guess.
What?
How long do you think it'll be if you had to guess from when he takes office to when he finally cuts them off?
Within a couple of days of taking office.
Couple of days. Okay, so that's a pretty optimistic outlook. All right, well, that's good to hear.
And now keep something else in mind. He met with some people from the Department of Defense, and he spoke afterwards that apparently they must have given him some cold, hard facts, because he said, oh, I rebuilt the military. Well, that's wrong. He didn't. He just shoved money at it, which is what everybody does.
Right.
But what he was saying was the military is in ruins. It is. He's recognized that. That's huge. Thank God, because that's going to change his calculus about what he's prepared to do with the American military. Because I can tell you, Donald Trump is the sort of person that says, I'm not going to go into a fight unless I know I can win it. And if he doesn't think he can win it, he's not going to do it. That's my impression.
What do you mean the military is in ruins? Because we hear that we spend so many multiples more money on our military budget than any other country, the multiple countries combined. So we don't think it's in ruins, but you say it is. In what sense do you mean that?
What if I hold out of storage a Ford Fairlane 500 from 1961, and I gave it a new coat of paint, I put some new tires on it, I tried to tune up the engine, change the oil, and then I presented it to you as the car of the 21st century? What would you say?
Is our equipment outdated in that way?
Well, my point is that's the Department of Defense.
Right.
You're dealing with an institution that was constructed in a couple of years after World War II. We got this thing called the 1947 National Security Act. Well, the 1947 National Security Act was a disaster, because what it did is it codified the way we had fought the Second World War. When Eisenhower was shown it, he said, well, this is terrible, because that's not the way we should organize to fight in the future. But he had very little influence at that point. And when he became president, all the usual suspects on the Hill and in industry had aligned themselves with the new status quo. And he had a lot of problems to deal with, and he did not have time or energy or longevity in office to fundamentally reform and change defense. So my point to you is that the Department of Defense is an anachronism. It's not organized in a way that makes any sense for the world of technology and battlefield intelligence that we have today. It's not designed for our needs, and we don't have the right incentives for people to join it. We are not recruiting the best. In many respects, we're getting much less than the best. Let's put it that way. And our service academies are another example. They've turned into watered down universities where boys and girls go to college together, and we're paying through the nose for it. It's a lot of nonsense. We should be graduating out of the military academy razors, people who are looking for a fight and are ready to fight. That's not what we're getting. We've lost our way completely. We haven't even talked about diversity, inclusion, and equity, let alone affirmative action. Affirmative action has been declared unconstitutional. That still persists. We need to get rid of all this stuff. We need to build a new force for the future. And you know, everybody's against that. Nobody wants to do it because they're worried about the money. Well, do I still get paid? Where's my money going? Right. People in Oklahoma, people in Florida, Mississippi, their revenue says, well, wait a minute, what does that do to the shipyards? What does that do to the cannon factory out front? I mean, let me give you a good example of the problem. In the 1930s, when Douglas MacArthur was chief of staff of the Army, he wanted to mechanize the horse cavalry. That's 1931, 32.